We are going to begin now. I'm Mary Newton. I'm representing the Reading League Wisconsin, and we have 4 Reading League chapters that are serving as co-hosts tonight. And I just want those people to jump on, unmute as I call on them so that you can associate their names and their faces and the states that they're from. So can we start with Illinois?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Brewster. I'm the board president of Reading League Illinois. I hope there's lots of Illinois representatives out there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. And now let's do Indiana.
Hi, I'm Krista Snyder, and I'm representing the Reading League Indiana. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Krista. And Rebecca, can we do Michigan next?
Rebecca Miles, the president of Reading League Michigan. Welcome.
Awesome. And Ohio.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shonda Kowalski, and I'm the president for the Reading League here in the state of Ohio. Welcome.
Thank you, Shonda. So we are the Great Lakes chapters of the Reading League. We're the ones that have some property on the Great Lakes. And we're all going to be participating in this conversation tonight about morphology with our special guest, Dr. Marcia Henry. There are a lot of people that are signed up and that are already logged in, so we have muted all the participants tonight. But if you have a pressing question, put it in the chat and we'll try to keep up with those as we move along through the evening. We also have a certificate of attendance that's available for anyone who needs one. And at closer to the end of the hour, I'll post a link in the chat that will enable you to request one. Please get that request in tonight, and then I'll email all of those out tomorrow. This is going to be a pretty informal conversation, but Marcia does have some slides that she's going to be sharing. And so we have done a PDF of the slides for you. And I think Anne is going to put that in there they are, in the chat so that you have the handouts. And the final slide on the handouts is contains links to the websites for the 5 of our Reading League chapters that are co-hosting this tonight. So if you're interested in just contacting one of the chapters, you're interested in membership, you're interested in events, that is a great place to start to get the information that you need. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest for this evening, Dr. Marcia Henry. Marcia has experience as a diagnostician, a tutor, a teacher, a professor, just about anything you can imagine. And she received her doctorate from Stanford University. And then up until her formal retirement, she has a very active post-retirement phase too. But up until retirement, she was a professor at San Jose State in California, where she directed the Center for Educational Research on Dyslexia. Marcia also has served as the president of the International Dyslexia Association, and she's received their Margaret Bird Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award. Marcia has authored the book Words and this book, which I just happen to have handy, Unlocking Literacy. And she's also the co-author of this instructional program, Patterns for Success. So I highly recommend both of those books and this instructional program there. I've used them all extensively and they're great. I was lucky enough to meet Marcia about 20 years ago. Hard to believe it was that long ago. Marcia was the instructor for a course that was being offered through the Children's Dyslexia Centers. So I had a chance to study with her. So I know where I got my interest in morphology, but Marcia, I thought we could start off the evening with you telling us how you got your interest in morphology.
Yes, I remember it so well, Mary, our work together, and then with Northwoods Literacy in Northern Wisconsin. Mary was one of the great teachers for that program. And so we've just had fun together over the years and learned a lot and taught a lot. I started working in this field in 1959. It's almost 64 years ago, which seems impossible. And of course, I started out with young children. I had the opportunity to work with Paula Rome and Jean Osman in Rochester, Minnesota, which is my hometown. And I taught with them for 15 years before I moved to California. And I started out learning Orton Gillingham with Paula and Jean as my mentors. And I worked with young children first because Paula said, you can learn along with the children, because I wasn't an education major. And so I was starting from square one, and I'm still learning today. And it certainly is true that we're lifetime learners, I think. But then I got interested in working with middle school students, and in those days it was called junior high school. And there was really no program to get into upper language, words that were more than 1 or 2 syllables. And I'd learned everything that I could learn about phonics and syllable patterns and those kinds of things. But I knew very little about, breaking longer words apart. And I started looking through literature, and I'd go to the library, and really there was almost nothing about what we now know of as morphology, the prefixes, the suffixes, the bases, the roots of words, the bigger chunks. And most of the research that had been done with oral language. There was very little with written language. But it seemed to me so obvious that these older kids just got so bored with phonics. And, here we were taking 7th and 8th graders through Fat Sam sat on the mat kind of stuff. And I just thought it was so beneath their intelligence, beneath their dignity to be, straddled with that. So I just started doing my own lessons and just started adding. I'd take a word like read, and then we'd do reread and misread and reading and so on. Spell, respell, misspell, speller, spelled, and so on. And the kids loved it. All of a sudden they saw that, yes, it was important to learn those phonics, the early kinds of things, but they could expand words. And so that's when I got my interest tweaked, and it's been going on ever since.
I think you're definitely ahead of the curve. And I know when I went to a variety of different trainings back around the 2000 era, yours was the only one that had anything in depth about morphology. So I was pleased to see in the last 6-7 years that morphology has kind of exploded, and people are really realizing its importance and how it can factor into things. So I think before we go any further, I just want to say, Pete, to the participants, the way we're organizing this is we have 5 very open-ended, broad questions that we're structuring our conversation around tonight. And I have the first one, which is the most basic question, and that is, what is morphology? Because I'm sure with 232 people who have logged in so far, there are some people out there who are still going like, not quite sure what is morphology. So Marcia, how would you define morphology, and where do those morphemes live inside of words?
Right, well, that's a good way to put it. The morphology is basically the study of the form, the structure of words. And when we look at polysyllabic words, words of more than 1 syllable, we'll notice that most of those words have chunks that we see over and over and over again. So we have what we call the base words, the word like read and spell and jump and run. And then what we do with those bases is we keep adding prefixes at the beginning, the chunks like re and miss and dis, and at the end like ing and and the plural s. And I can give you a more, let me get my slides up here.
And those are all, those chunks that you're talking about are all chunks of meaning, right?
That's right. They
Yeah.
all carry meaning. Now, if I have the word re and I ask you to reread something, I'm asking you to read it again. Re means again. If I say misread something, I misread the word, then it means it has a negative connotation. I've done it wrong. The prefixes and the bases or roots, many people use those terms interchangeably, they hold what we call semantic meaning. There's direct meaning. The suffixes, however, you'd be hard pressed in many cases to give a meaning to many of the suffixes. Let's take OUS as in famous and generous. Well, it's hard to see what that does, but mainly what the suffixes do is they provide meaning in what we call syntactic meaning through the syntax. It's what is it a verb? Is it an adjective? I often use the example of OUS versus ESS, us versus us. They're both pronounced exactly the same, but words ending in ESS, like actress and hostess and waitress and princess and lioness, all indicate a female, and it's a female noun, whereas OUS is always an adjective, generous, humorous, dangerous, adventurous. So meaning goes beyond just semantic meaning as in vocabulary, but also that syntactic meaning. Now, this is from the American Heritage Dictionary, one of my favorites, the 4th edition. And they say that in linguistics, morphology is the study of the structure and form of words in language or a language, including inflection, derivation, and the formation of compounds. And we'll go into that in a little more. Now, all of these parts, these chunks that we've talked about, these forms of words, are called morphemes. And they are the smallest meaningful linguistic unit in a word. So bases, roots, prefixes, and suffixes are all morphemes. Now, I'm going to show just one other slide here, or maybe a couple. This is one of my very favorite descriptions of English, and it's called, Robert Claiborne, the author of this wonderful book, calls English a polyglot. Now, does anybody know what poly means? I'll bet a lot of you know that it means many. And glot, think of other words like epiglottis, having to do with the tongue, the throat. And so English is a language of many tongues. And he says the truth is that if following foreign words could destroy a language, English would be dead, borrowed from Old Norse, deceased from French, defunct from Latin, and kaput from German. When it comes to borrowing, English excels from Latin, surpasses from French, and eclipses from Greek, any other tongue, past or present. And I know we're going to get back to etymology towards the end, but this is what etymology is. It's the origin, the history of the words. And I'll show you in a little bit how it matters, why that matters. Let me just see what else I have. Oh, I know at one point you mentioned, Mary, that so many people now are so familiar with Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. And you brought up the question, where does morphology fit? Well, I saw or I heard Hollis say fairly recently that possibly she needs to incorporate morphology in some way in here, but it certainly comes into both the language comprehension aspect of the rope, primarily through vocabulary, and it also is so important in decoding and in spelling. And so it kind of has both threads, and that I always think of it as kind of a triple play. It helps with expand our vocabulary, it enhances our decoding ability, as well as our spelling ability.
And what do you think about maybe making that a quadruple play? Because I think a lot of those suffixes, as you were just talking about, expand our knowledge of syntax and make us more aware of, oh, this word is serving as a noun here, this word is a verb, this word is an adjective or an adverb. So I think syntax, it contributes too, but I think we got so used to the reading rope that if something's not specifically on there and you don't see morphology, it's like, whoop, what's morphology?
Right.
It didn't tell, Scarborough's rope didn't tell me to teach morphology, but it's just, it's incorporated in so many of these different strands.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So I like to think of like morphemes as kind of like analogous to phonemes, where phonemes are the smallest unit of speech in the word, and the morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in the word. So they're similar in that way, but of course, very different use in the words. Do we want to do, I know you have something in here about, we're going to do that later, about some practice on, I think we'll leave that for later. I think we just want to remind people that when we're talking about the morphemes, where do they live in the word? They're in the root or the base, they're in the prefix, and they're in the suffix. And sometimes you can have multiple prefixes or multiple suffixes, right? So in their super long words, you get a lot of those. And so that's where those meaning units are. And a lot of us have, we know about prefixes and suffixes and roots, but we just haven't thought of them in terms of, oh, these are morphemes. That's what they are. That's what they are.
And we'll have lots of examples of that.
Yeah. So I think we will go on to our next question, which is Krista. Do you want to pose our next question for Marcia?
Sure. Thank you. So Marcia, I think you touched on this a little bit with your first when you were first speaking about morphology. Why is it so important to teach? Why is morphology important? And then why should we teach it?
Okay, good question. And again, I have some slides that might be useful. Let me just pull that up. One of the things that's important is that English is not only a polyglot, it's a morphophonemic language. And this term by Dick Vinesky, the late Dick Vinesky, was a linguist, and he was at the University of Wisconsin at one time, Mary, long time ago. And then he ended up in Delaware. But he sees it as both that meaning component and that sound component. And he has said that morphemes retain their spelling while the pronunciation may change. So take a word like sign. Somebody might say, well, why would that have, why is that G there? Well, when I say signify or signature, then I actually hear the G, the hard G sound. Think of magical and magician, electric, electricity. It changes because of the suffix. Credible, credulous, sane, sanity. So the meaning stays the same in those bases: sign, magical, electric, credible, sane, but the actual sound pronunciation will change. Also, these chunks, there aren't that many. When you think of English as being a language of about 1 million words, there are about, when you consider the Latin and Greek roots, there are about, maybe 50 of each of those that are really important. And then there are about the same number of usable prefixes and suffixes. So let's say we have 200 unique spellings of prefixes, suffixes, and Latin and Greek roots. Out of 1 million, that's a handful. That's not even a handful. It's a little pinky full. And as I said earlier, that triple play or quadruple, as Mary has pointed out, enhances decoding, spelling, vocabulary, and grammar. And we also have to consider our content area texts. And I'm not going to show those slides, but you have them in your handouts. I was amazed to start, when I was writing the Unlocking Literacy book, I asked my friends who had children in grade school to let me borrow their social studies and math and science textbooks. And I was amazed at the words in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade that contain so many of the Latin and Greek word roots and prefixes and suffixes. And I thought, gosh, if these kids aren't introduced to these units that are used, these morphemes that are used over and over and over again, they're going to just be in such trouble. And I think my first scholarly paper that was published anyway, was called Beyond Phonics. And this was in 1987, I think it was 86 or 87. And it was published in the Annals of Dyslexia. And it talked all about the morphology, that we have to go beyond phonics to get beyond the primer stage. Our research group at San Jose State worked with 5 high school, it was called Basic English, and it was for kids with learning disabilities. And we found that they knew phonics. They'd had phonics, fortunately, but phonics alone could only get them to about a 2nd grade level. Because if you take a multisyllabic word like vocabulary and try to go v, a, k, a, b, o, or e, or something, you can't get vocabulary out of that. So those are the reasons we should teach it. and why it's important to teach it, at least from my perspective. And this spelling meaning connection is just so important. The work of Pete Bowers, some of you know his work through structured word inquiry. And he has a wonderful website with lots of information at wordworkskingston.com. He's from Kingston, or in that area of Ontario. And he says, if you're stuck on a spelling, figure out, do you know what the word means? Can you figure out how it's built, how we put it together? What other related words can you think of? And then what are the sounds that matter? So getting, first of all, in the importance of meaning. If I have a word like read, do I mean to read a book, or do I mean the clarinet is a reed instrument? Or am I talking about the reeds in the swamp? And so we need to know meaning before we can spell the word correctly. Well, I don't know when this fits, Mary, but
I'm not sure. If you want to do it here, it's fine. It would also fit in etymology, but this is this is great.
I'll come back to that. Okay, so I'll get out of this now.
Okay.
Did I get your question?
Yeah, and I think one additional thing that I was just curious about is, sometimes we know that things are important, but we figure we don't really need to teach them because somehow the kids will pick them up. And, I know that I've read a lot of things lately that seem to indicate that kids with dyslexia or certain language disabilities are not very good at picking up on these morphemes. They don't even realize that words are structured this way. And if you give them that knowledge, they pick it up so quickly. I think about a middle school science class that I observed, and I have two different sections by two different teachers, and they had a vocabulary unit. And one of the teachers just was, here are the words, and, memorize the meanings of these words, and we're going to have a matching test. And the other teacher was talking about where these words came from, and all the ones that had photo in it had something to do with light, and whenever you saw SYN, it had to do something with synthesis or coming together, and, all these very helpful ways, not just to learn one morpheme, but to become aware that that's how a lot of multisyllabic words are structured. And once you're aware, then you're able better to look for them,
Right.
I think so.
A perfect example of that, I was asked to speak. This was to an IDEA branch years ago. And I was asked to speak to a group of college students or young 20s. They didn't have to be in college, but many of them were mostly in community colleges. And I had them do and I'll show an example, in fact, of what I'm talking about, but later on. But I had them do together as a group, a web on struct, the Latin root struct. And first I had them generate words. So they came up with words like construct and structure and destruct and destructive and so on. And afterwards, a young man came up to me and he said, "I am so mad." And I kind of was taken aback. In the Lake Wobegon way, I thought, oh my goodness, how have I offended him? And I felt just terrible, just the way he got him so mad. And I said, well, how can I help? And he said, I said, well, what are you so mad about? And he said, they never told me. And I looked at him and I said, "What?" I knew immediately. And I said, "Well, what didn't they tell you?" "Well, they never told me that same morpheme," because we had talked about what this root was called, a morpheme, a Latin morpheme. And he said, "They never told me that struct, instruct, and destruct, and construct, and construction, and instructor, it's all the same struct." It's just like you said, Mary, they don't recognize very often kids with dyslexia or severe reading disability, whatever we want to call it. They don't recognize something that seems so clear to those of us who pick up reading more readily, more easily.
I
Marcia-
think it's
oh.
not just the students sometimes who are mad, but sometimes in my experience, when I've been doing some training, it's the teachers who are mad because they didn't know about morphology. And so they weren't being able to get things across to their students the way they wanted to. And once they learned about it, they went, "Oh, this makes a whole lot of sense. And it's going to make my teaching easier. And it's going to make my students' learning more effective." So Anne, I think we're going to pop over to you and let you do question number 3.
All right, thank you. And I feel like it's a very nice segue because we're starting to talk a little bit about how to teach this. So our next question for you, Marcia, is when should we start to teach morphology? And maybe you could share an appropriate scope and sequence with us. And I might add, just piggybacking on something that you and Mary were just talking about, not just when should we start to teach it, but also in what context? Because I feel like I'm hearing you talk about, maybe you could teach it in the science classroom, or you could teach it in the social studies classroom. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yes, it's like Mary indicated it early on in our session. We used to think we had to wait till high school to teach Latin and Greek word roots. But now that there's been research showing that even in first grade, in primers, we see lots of the suffixes, the inflected endings. That is the ed, the past tense, the plural s, the er. So kids are exposed to morphemes very early on, and they use it in their own speaking language, in their oral language. But we've tended to wait. And this is one of the concerns that I've had for years, is the push, especially in the last 20, 30 years, of all the teaching of reading. It all should be done by 3rd grade. I mean, the emphasis has been on K through 3, not beyond that. And so almost none of the basal series that kids are using go in any depth into the morphemes. I have not seen one that spends any time, maybe a handful of prefixes and suffixes, but not nearly enough. And certainly, as you say, you can certainly teach that. I'm going to get a slide up while I'm saying this. Let's see. Oh, here we go. I don't know why I have to do this each time, but okay. In terms of a continuum, this would be my ideal world, but of course it doesn't exist. But this would be my dream world. That kindergarten, we spend a lot of time on phonemic awareness, not so much getting into letters and corresponding sounds towards the end of kindergarten, yes. And in your first grade, you'd like to go through almost all of the ABCs and the corresponding sounds. Into second, beginning mid-first through second into third, getting into all of the consonant digraphs, the vowel digraphs, and so on. The compound words, the syllable patterns. And remember that compound words, in a word like railroad, we have how many morphemes? We have two. We have two morphemes because rail and road are both bases. So compound words were already starting with prefix or with the bases. And we can start talking about morphemes, about meaning units. And then we want to start into the prefixes and suffixes, certainly by mid-first to second grade. By third grade, you want to start getting into Latin roots, and fourth, fifth, getting into the Greek roots. That would serve you very well. And you know, I as Mary said early on, it's just so, I'm so gratified that so many more people are writing about morphology and studying morphology. And hopefully at some point the various reading series will get on board as well. It's been a long haul to try and get that to happen.
I
Did
think
I
a
answer
lot
that?
of this can be done, a lot of it can be done orally too. It's not, you don't have to do everything through reading and spelling, but you know, a lot of oral activities that you can do, especially in content area classes, where you just call their attention to what's going on in the words.
Right. Okay, am I ready for the next one?
Okay, we are moving on to Rebecca. You have the next question.
Great. So, Marcia, what are some instructional techniques for teaching morphology, and what are resources that are currently available?
Yes, and I've given you a whole list of resources towards the end of the handouts. But let me share some ideas for teaching, some instructional strategies that might be useful. Now, you can do this along with me. I'd like you to count the morphemes in these words. How many think one? How many think two? Two it is. It's dog is the base and the plural S. How about railroad? Oh, I gave that away. That's a compound. It's two. Respell. How many morphemes? Three. What is the prefix? What is the base? Spell. And how about the suffix? The ed. And that's the kind of thing. Now, here's a good one. How many, if I asked you how many syllables in this word, tell me how many syllables in misunderstanding. We have 5. How many morphemes do we have? We have only 4. That's right. We have miss, we have under, not un and der, but under. Stand is my base and the ing suffix. Another kind of activity that's great for classrooms, and this was actually done in a classroom in China. It was an international school in Beijing. And so you take a base like friend and come up, have the kids generate words. So you have friendship, friendships, friendless, befriend, befriends, befriended, befriending, boyfriend, boyfriends, pen friend, and plural. That's like a pen pal. Girlfriend, girlfriends, etc. Then we take friendly, and look at all what we can do with friendly. Friendlier, friendliest, friendliness, unfriendly, unfriendlier, etc. So these kinds of things are great to do with classrooms. Get kids in groups of 2 or 3. They can do it on the board, they can do it in their notebooks. Now, this is from Pete Bauer's work, and this is called a matrix. And you see that he takes the base word, then he has a couple prefixes that we can use, and then look at all the different suffixes. So we can have befriend, befriends, befriended, friend-like. So here I've got a compound with a secondary base word. Another kind of thing, here's a web on word. This is from Melvin Ramsden, now called Michel Rameau, and his website is realspelling.fr for France. And I met Michel and Pete Bowers at a meeting in Bangkok about 23 years ago or so. And we were the only 3 who were really interested in morphology at this meeting. But it was a great get together. Here are those, all the words that I mentioned to you. What I want to do is, if we could, go back just a minute. Must be a quicker way. This is kind of the framework that I've worked from since the early 80s, when I was at Stanford, and I wanted to, for my dissertation, I wanted to see what teachers knew and if they learned this, what I'm going to describe, did their students become better readers and spellers? And I had 12 teachers, and so I had this whole design spelled out, and my advisor said, Bob Kelfie said, don't tell me, bring me your picture. Well, I had never thought in pictures. I don't think that way. I'm a much more linear thinker. And it took me 2 years to come up with this, almost 2 years. But what I realized was that it was helpful if teachers, and therefore their students, knew about phonics, the letter sound correspondences, if they understood syllable patterns, and if they understood morpheme patterns. The thing I learned, and I knew a lot about the first 2 and morpheme patterns just from my own teaching, but I hadn't realized the importance of the etymology, the Anglo-Saxon, the Latin, and the Greek. And depending on the different languages that English has stemmed from, our words change. Let me give you an example. Think of a spelling bee. And so a word is given and it has a k sound in it, but do I use CH as in chemist? Do I use that if it would be China, etc.? Well, if it's the sound, I know that it's going to be CH, the Greek. So that's why it's important to understand what language do some of these words stem from. So here's more of a filled out framework for literacy instruction. So in letter sound correspondences, I teach my consonants, my vowels. The schwa is prevalent in Latin, but all of the phonics, the letter sound correspondences are the same. Happily, in Latin, there are very few vowel digraphs. The Greek has its own unique letter sound correspondence. For instance, the PH for the CH for ch, as in scholar and chorus, Y as I and symphony, also the PS, the RH, and so on. Here's the syllable patterns and the morpheme patterns. So in the morpheme patterns for Old English or Anglo-Saxon, you can use either term. You have both compounding and affixing. Affixing just means prefix and suffix. In Latin, you have primarily affixing, and in Greek, you have primarily compounding. So there's a difference in the structure of these words. Okay. I hope I answered that question. Okay.
Do you want to, I think there is a lot of, there tends to be confusion with the terms base and root, just because people use them differently. You know, different people use different terminology. Do you want to give a definition of what you would call a base and what you would call a root, or do you refer to bound bases and free bases? Or
we certainly talk about a bound base and a free base. A bound base is one that has to have a prefix or suffix. So the Latin and Greek are not, well, the Latin especially is, the Latin roots are almost always bound bases. I've always used the term base for the Anglo-Saxon Old English words that tend to be more for the primer level. And then I use Latin and Greek, I use the term root. I know Pete Bowers and the SWI group, the structured word inquiry, they just use base all the time. But people that I was influenced by, with like Dick Vanesky's work, and Robert Claiborne, people like that, they use the term root more consistently. They don't use base nearly as much. I think you just have to, be consistent. But I agree, it can be confusing.
yeah, I would agree with that. I've always used root and base, and one of the ways that this helped me with kids is a lot of times if you're working on morphemes, you'll use a tree, and then people will they'll have something, a base word at the bottom of the tree, like reed, and then they'll have different prefixes and suffixes up in the leaves, and you make words out of them. And the way I always explain it to my students is the base, well, I use that to mean a free base, right? A freestanding word. It's at the base of the tree, you can see it, right? You know what it is. It's a word that's familiar to you, and then you can go and add on to it. A root is under the ground, and sometimes the meaning is not so clear, because it's not a word that stands on its own. So, and sometimes it's derived very directly from the language that it was taken from. Sometimes it's gone through a bunch of shifts. So a lot of times the root is not super clear. And I think if you use the tree at all, it helps to distinguish between a root and a base, and just that the roots are going to take a little more effort to recognize.
Good. Yeah, I like that.
So, all right, we're kind of done with this. with this question, and I think we'll go on to Shonda now with question number 5.
Yeah, and we have actually already been doing some discussing about this, so maybe this will just piggyback on that a little bit. So our last question for you is, how is morphology related to etymology? And I know you already started talking about the chart and showing us that. So if there's anything else that you wanted to add or maybe clarify for the group, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, let me go back to a slide that I skipped the last time, and if I can. Oh, too far. Oh, okay. This is just, this was done by the reading project that I was in at Stanford. And this is the layers of language with the Anglo-Saxon at the base. And maybe that's why I've always called that level the base word. And then we have the various words that come from Latin, the 5 different Romance languages, and then we have the Greek. Now, interestingly, if you did a statistical analysis, which I have not done, but others have, you'll find that the Anglo-Saxon is about 10 to 20% of our words that we use come from Anglo-Saxon or Old English. The Romance, about 55% come from the Romance, the Latin, and about 12 from Greek, 12% of the words come from Greek, and those are almost all in the science textbooks. You asked about how does etymology relate to morphology. Well, I love this slide. I was at an IDA meeting, the national meeting in Philadelphia years ago, and Pete Bowers gave a talk called The Analogy of Triangulation. And Dennis Weimer from Virginia had a talk called Theologies of Language. And they both had similar schema of what they were talking about. And they have phonology. We know what that is, the study of the sound system in words. The etymology, which is the history, the word origin. And we have the morphology. And now that after I had developed that 3x3 matrix, and I had studied more of the etymology, I realized how important it was. And I have a slide, I think, later on, and I have a lot of slides and a lot of different other kinds of activities. I don't have a clock. Oh wait, I do.
It's 7:53.
Oh my gosh, we're running out of time.
We got 7 minutes to go. We can do a lot in 7 minutes.
Okay. Let me just shift here. Sorry. So you'll notice that a lot of the activities, like match prefixes with their meanings, match suffixes with their parts of speech, match Latin or Greek bases with their meaning, or meaning with a Latin and Greek bases. Find the morphemes in a list of words, either bound or free morphemes. Look for Old English, Latin or Greek base words in a content area text, and so on. A lot of those have to do with the the etymology. Did they come from Latin or Greek? Here's the kind of thing I had those older students do together to kind of to build this type of a web. This is from Pete Bowers. This is one of his word matrices with the Latin root struct. He has what are called word sums from the matrix. We were talking earlier, think of this word, reconstructionist. How many prefixes in reconstructionist? We have 2, right? Recon. My root is struct. I have 2 suffixes, ION and IST. TION is not a suffix. It sounds, we'd like it to be just because it says shun. I mean, we say it, I can't really mark that. TION, but then the root would be struck, and it's struct, and then it's ION and IST. I always point that out because a lot of the books that you might read talk about TION as being the full suffix. Technically, it's not. You can read through all of these by yourself. And I did want to show you this since we're talking about etymology. This is from the online Etymology Dictionary. And it's just a wonderful find, and it's free. You can go to it online. You type in your word, and my word was pugilism. It's from the Latin. 1789 is the first time it was seen, from the Latin pugil, boxer or fist fighter, related to pugnus, fist, fighting with fists, now obsolete. Pugnacious in 1640, pugilist 1789, pugnacity 1600. So these are old world. Douglas Harper is the developer of this, and he is a man who just got terribly interested in etymology. And I've also given you some resources. We have from language, some of you may have seen that book, Susan Eber's Vocabulary Through Morphemes. Deb Glazer has a new book, Morpheme Magic, which is very nice. Sue Hegland and Gail Venable have 2 new books with very interesting stuff on words. Then you have the ones that Mary mentioned, the Unlocking Literacy and Words and Patterns for Success. Louisa Moats, of course, with Speech to Print. So those are some resources for you. And then for those of you who want to study more and see some of the research primarily from the last 20 years, there are quite a few new articles out, and you might, if you're working on a degree or anything like that, these would be useful resources for you. Here are some websites that are excellent. I have that online etymology dictionary that I mentioned, Real Spelling from France, Vocabulary, that's Susan Eber's. word nerdery is a wonderful piece from Down Under, and so on. So those, and Pete Bauer's word works, Kingston. So is there anything else?
I think we've reached the end. Somebody had a very specific question on your layers of language triangle. Could you just repeat the percentages of words in English that are in the different layers?
At the Anglo-Saxon, it's about 15 to 20%. That estimate came from Richard Lederer, who is not only a linguist, but a humorist. And then at the Greek, it's approximately Latin is approximately 55%, and the Greek approximately 12%.
And just that lower level, the Anglo-Saxon level, of course, even though it's only 15 to 20%, they're some of our most commonly used words. So we
That's
see
right,
them a lot.
absolutely.
So there's a difference between, percentage of our language and the percentage that we tend to use. But yeah, so
right. But so much of the content area reading in the upper grades is from the Latin, social studies, literature, and the math and science more from the Greek. So even though that's a small percentage, it's very important for those fields. Mary mentioned the Unlocking Literacy book, and that has complete scope and sequence in it. You can get it from your public library, and if you didn't want to have get a copy, but so there's just lots of information in all those programs.
Yeah, well, I want to thank everybody for hanging with us to the end. I would seem like there's so much more we could do. We had 60 minutes, and we're trying to take Marcia's 60 years of knowledge and insights and trying to pack it into 60 minutes, which has turned out to be rather impossible, but we did our best on that. Don't forget, if you have a question, Marcia's contact information is on the slide that's on the screen right now, and it's in your handout. And if you need that certificate of attendance, please fill out that form tonight. You'll get that tomorrow. We will be posting the recording of tonight's meeting on Reading League Wisconsin YouTube channel. You can access it there if you want to watch it again or recommend it to friends. And I just want to thank Marcia for being so generous with her time and all of her knowledge and sharing it with us tonight. That was a special treat for us. And thank you to all my colleagues from the other chapters for being co-hosts. It's a delight to get together with you, and it helps us expand our audience and reach more people, which is great. And thank you to all the participants who joined in, and just thank you for everything you do every day, and stay in touch with us, and we'll all keep learning, I'm sure. So good night, everybody.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.